Ladies and gentlemen, hit subscribe to this channel right now. Supreme Court appears likely to side with Trump on some presidential immunity. I have been telling you this for months now. This week, it will officially take place. It's essentially already taken place. Hit subscribe. Number one, Trump, and you'll hear from legal scholars in a second, but Trump had the unconstitutional ban in Colorado overturned unanimously. I said it would be a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court to overturn the absurd unconstitutional ban by the Colorado Supreme Court. Number two, the second victory for Trump. When they talk about democracy, they don't really mean democracy. They mean what's good for their political party. Democracy is upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States of America that decides on the constitutionality of laws and of, in this case, a guilty verdict in Colorado. They will overturn the Colorado verdict. It is unconstitutional. A state cannot level a federal statute at anyone without the federal government involved. But before that, you're going to get a huge immunity victory. You're going to get partial immunity. Trump will be able to dissolve the special counsel when he becomes president, because we're looking at a landslide victory, ladies and gentlemen, on November 5th, 2024. Hit subscribe to this channel. We're on our way to 300,000 subscribers. It's because of you. To my viewers in the Philippines, in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Korea, everywhere around the world, thank you so very much. Be here this week, ladies and gentlemen, this week when we get a huge, monumental, historic, constitutional victory for Trump. I have been telling you he's going to get partial immunity for months. He's allowed to perform a speech. You cannot convict and imprison a president on a very broad, ambiguous, vague legal statutes. This is completely absurd. To my members, thank you so very much. To the Super Chat, thank you. This is John Yoo, former Attorney General, explaining exactly what I have been saying. A state does not have the jurisdiction to level a federal crime at Trump. So we'll get to the guilty conviction first, and then we'll get to immunity. The immunity is a slam dunk case. It's so easy. The overturning of Trump's guilty verdict is just as easy, just as simple to understand. You would have to be a complete imbecile to think that the Colorado State Supreme Court decision was constitutional. You'd have to be a complete fool to think that the guilty verdict was constitutional, or that Trump has zero immunity from prosecution. You cannot decide that a president has deceived the American public when Mashed Potato Brains, our current occupant in the Oval Office, all he does is deceive and engage in deception every single day. So let's continue. This is John Yoo. Hit subscribe right now.
For our nation, how bad is it for our electoral system? How bad is it for the rule of law, for federalism, the whole kit and caboodle?
Mark, thanks for having me back. I am saddened at what this case has now done to our political and constitutional system. It's hard to exaggerate the harm that it's going to do, not just to Donald Trump. He's important, but the more important question is, what does this do to our institutions? As you said, our legal system, our electoral system, our system of federalism and the separation of powers for all future presidents, for all future citizens. First, we have never prosecuted a former president before. This was not because past presidents hadn't done anything bad. It's because we thought it was the best thing for our separation of powers to leave presidents alone. And the reason why is because the Constitution concentrates so much responsibility and authority in the president to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, to protect the country from foreign threats, that we don't want our presidents, when they're making the hardest decisions on behalf of the country, to be worrying about whether they're going to be prosecuted or not. We don't want our presidents to be insurance claims adjusters worrying about risks and balances of their own personal finances and their own personal legal situation. We want them to decide what's best for the country. Now, because this case was so frivolous, because it was based on such concocted legal theories, it opens the door wide now for any DA, and there are 2,500 of them in the country, any DA to sue and prosecute any president, any past president, perhaps any sitting president under the theories that were put forward earlier. I think an even worse problem is for the rule of law. Because what we've all learned now, I think, is that prosecutors can destroy a person. They can destroy a person's reputation, his finances, just by investigating them, even before they get to court, just by publicly announcing that they're investigating someone. We have for 230 years relied on prosecutors, on our elected chief executives, governors, and presidents to show, again, statesmanship, to go show good judgment, not to abuse this power. But now what we've seen is that I think the Biden Justice Department and these blue city DAs are abusing this power, not to try to stop crime, but to target individuals because they don't like them, because they're unpopular, and then to find the crimes to fit the man. That is directly a direct assault on the rule of law. And that harms all of us in the country, all the citizens, not just Trump, not just presidents, but you and me and everyone else.
And what about the electoral system when you have one of these DAs deciding that they get to decide or try to decide the outcome of an election through the process, that they can make a ambiguous reference to federal law, seize jurisdiction from what is a complex layer of federal authorities and decision makers when it comes to federal election campaign law, let alone seize the authority from federal courts and the Supreme Court to make these decisions?
A state does not have the authority. The state of New York, Colorado, no state has the authority to level a federal statute at anyone without the specific federal government department involved. So the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, dropped the hush money case. They actually fined Hillary Clinton and the DNC, her campaign, for purchasing the Steele dossier, which was a compilation of lies and deceit and information that completely misinforms. Okay, the Democrats received a fine from the FEC. Trump did not, yet he was convicted of an imaginary FEC fine. The federal government, the Department of Justice, the FEC dropped the case against Trump, yet he was still convicted. Okay, that is, and the verdict in New York did not mention a specific legal statute. There was not a specific code or legal statute that Trump broke. That's a Sixth Amendment violation. You're supposed to know what you're convicted of.
Regardless of what the New York courts say up and down the chain, I mean, whatever the New York courts say up and down the chain, that is not the final decision. If the federal Supreme Court decides to step in, that's the final decision for you, New York. So if I'm in California and I see that it worked in New York, because we have this lumbering appellate process, but I can interfere with an election. By the time the appellate process catches up with me, so be it. They're going to time it the same way. So this can really become a cancer on the political campaign system of the highest federal official in the United States, and the election there too, no?
Mark, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law.
Only the federal government can enforce federal law. It's so simple. That's why this channel is growing. I just focus on simple constitutional themes. This is not difficult to understand. I talk about other things, of course, as well. But lately, I've been focusing on very monumental, historic victories for Trump on the horizon within the next couple hours, couple days. Only the federal government can enforce federal law. This is so brilliantly stated.
The Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute, has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened here is that the DA, approved by this judge, Judge Merchan, grabbed the authority away and basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
When we come back, John Yoo, that is my question. So should we sit on our hands, say there's nothing we can do?
So Mark Levin is a big proponent of this going to the Supreme Court. It will go to the Supreme Court. It will go to the Supreme Court because he might get a jail sentence or prison sentence. Okay, there's a 2% chance that he actually goes to jail, or 5%. The Supreme Court will get involved immediately if they give him a jail sentence, or prison sentence, which they will. So they will give him a prison sentence. They could stay it, and they could just say, well, you know what? It's a prison sentence, but we're not going to send him to prison. We'll give him either house arrest or community service, or we'll postpone the prison sentence indefinitely just to let people know that he's a criminal, he's a felon, he's a convicted felon, Trump. And really, it's like they commit crimes with Hunter's laptop, Clinton's servers with top secret intel, impossible to even transfer from a cybersecurity perspective, highly illegal. What Biden did was even worse than Clinton, with classified data in his garage, and neither of them had the power to declassify. We can go on forever. The Democrats are definitely above the law. That won't be the case when Trump regains the Oval Office, but they're not going to. You have 2 victories on the horizon, 3. Number one, the most important is November 5th, but the other 2 before November 5th. Immunity this week, and in a couple of weeks, they overturn the guilty verdict. This is the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the World Series, the Kentucky Derby, NHL Finals, WrestleMania 3, times a million, okay, times 10,000, let's say, okay? And so Democrats are going to be livid. Oh my God, the nation. Let's continue.
Manhattan DA says he will not appear on Capitol Hill today as House Republicans hold a hearing on former President Trump's New York trial. Bragg citing scheduling conflicts. He is set to testify, though, on July 12th, just one day after Trump's sentencing. Federal Election Commissioner Trey Traynor and Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey set to testify today at today's hearing, and they join me now. Trey, you notice I emphasized the election in your title. I guess we're finally set to hear from somebody who actually understands how election law works. Juan Merchan cannot silence you. What are the top points, Trey, you're going to try and drive home today?
Well, the most important point is that Judge Merchan completely obliterated what's been longstanding federal election law with the jury charge that he gave, asking the jury whether Donald Trump had willfully contributed to a campaign. And the legal standard has long been knowing and willful standard. So he's completely upended that standard. And it's one of those things where the Department of Justice.
It wasn't even the legal standard they used. The FEC dropped the case, but in the John Edwards case, people don't get convicted of paying hush money. It's completely legal, and it's a payment that would have been made with or without a campaign. That's what makes it legal.
Justice should have intervened early in this case and protected the jurisdiction of the federal government to enforce federal campaign finance law. They didn't. They didn't protect the jurisdiction of the Federal Election Commission, and it's completely perplexing why they didn't do that. There's long-standing Supreme Court precedent that says that they should have. And
it's just how law works. People always fight over jurisdiction. They never give that up, and in this case, it was ceded so easily. Andrew, Democrats, of course, are going to try and flip the script, calling today's hearing playing politics, and they're going to make this point, Andrew, A.G. Bailey. They merely follow the facts and the law up there in New York City. How will you cut the legs out from under that argument?
Well, they bent the law to meet the facts in a specious legal charge. There's an unseemly amount of prosecutorial misconduct. And at the end of the day, what that does is it injects both statutory and constitutional violations into the process from the charging document onto the jury deliberations. And so this is a legally errant conviction. It's not a legally valid conviction. And that emphasizes the illicit nature of the witch hunt prosecution. And it's important that the American people understand that the goal here was never to convict President Trump of a crime. It was always to remove him from the campaign trail. Now, this is a presidential candidate that has a right to speak and that we as a people have a right to access. This has done immeasurable damage to our democratic republic, and we've got to hold wrongdoers accountable.
Let's focus on this Matthew Colangelo, Alvin Bragg dichotomy here at AG Bailey, because the number 3 starter right now in the Yankees rotation is not waving his hand and saying, please send me to single A so I can ply my craft. What possible reason could Matthew Colangelo, the number 3 at the Department of Justice, have to leave the DOJ, go down to the Manhattan DA, if not for his desire to help the Democrats and get Trump?
Yeah, the DOJ may not have intervened to reassert the jurisdiction of the FEC. That's the appropriate legal avenue for the DOJ. But instead, what they did was deploy resources to the state of New York in the form of Matthew Colangelo, like you said, the former third-ranking official in Biden's Department of Justice, who led the trial court prosecution against President Trump on behalf of Alvin Bragg. So he takes a pay cut to go work in state court. He's politically motivated. Those prosecutors should have been disqualified from prosecuting that case. There was no case to begin with. A subsequent prosecutor that the court could have appointed would have identified that and dismissed it before it got this far. And again, Biden is behind this whole thing. I mean, he has managed the Department of Justice that also administers grants on behalf of the Soros-backed Vera Institute to Alvin Bragg's office with the intent of dismantling the criminal justice system. So while Alvin Bragg is ignoring crime in the subways and on the city streets, he is being trained to weaponize the criminal justice system against Biden's political opponents.
Trey.
By the way, people who recently broke laws in New York in a high-profile event, and of course, charges were dropped. So people are above the law if you break laws, apparently, possibly, potentially, like the Honorable James Comey says, potentially, if you happen to coincide with the political ideology of those deciding what is and isn't lawful.
Quick final word to you. If we don't stop this lawfare right now in its tracks, can our century-old justice system survive?
No, it can't. And we have a big threat to the First Amendment and whether or not candidates can actually run for office in any state, because we'll have turned loose all the prosecutors across the country, whether they be state or local prosecutors, to go after individual candidates for perceived violations of campaign finance law.
Thank you for what you're about to do on Capitol Hill today.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is pretty obvious. You cannot level a state cannot level a federal statute at anyone without the federal government involved. Then you have Trump, and we'll get to him in a second. We're going to continue with the guilty conviction that will be overturned by the Supreme Court. You can't say that Trump, under 18 U.S. Code 371, which is what the special counsel used, and I wrote an article about this in the Federalist years back about how certain government officials should be charged under that statute. You can't say he deceived people, and therefore, because he deceived people in a speech, he was no longer president. That's absurd. Everything Biden says is deceptive. So you're going to convict him for everything he says? Anyway, hit subscribe if you're new to this channel. By the way, I will have the next couple of days 2 live streams. Look out for the live stream at around 2 p.m., 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow.
Speaker Johnson wants the Supreme Court to step in on Trump's verdicts. Roll it.
I haven't had conversations with the justices. I just know their character, their personality. I know what they've said in the past. They are deeply concerned, as we are, about maintaining our system of justice. I think they're concerned about using courtrooms for politics and political retribution. We all are. We all should be. Every American. That's what I was referring to. And I think in their heart of hearts, they're concerned about it just like we are.
Right. Roger Severino is a former DOJ trial attorney and joins me now. Roger, Can the Supreme Court step in?
Yes, it can. Maybe not right now because there's an appeal process, but if he's actually convicted and sent to jail, he was already convicted. If he's sent to jail, there's a petition called habeas that could go to federal court. But
so unfortunately, what might happen is that he's convicted of, he is sent, they give him a jail or prison sentence. There's like a 5% chance he actually goes to jail, which the Supreme Court has to step in and will. But once that ball is set in motion, okay, then the Supreme Court everything is expedited. They have to look at the case because the future of the country is at stake. Overturn the case 100%. Now, I don't know the percentage of when they accept the case.
this just goes to show we're discussing whether or not a former president running for office right now might face jail time. This is shocking that America has reached this point where we're trying to convict political opponents instead of deciding at the ballot box. I mean, President Trump was right. After the real conviction, the real decision, the real verdict is going to be on November 5th.
But do you believe that this was a deliberate political having a go at Donald Trump politically through the courts?
Oh, absolutely. They invented a crime, and the legal errors are just legion. Here you had a politicized judge with a politicized prosecutor and a politicized jury pool inventing a new crime of a federal campaign finance violation based on falsification of state records. It is so confusing. And then the judge said, you don't even have to be unanimous in the verdict. You could have 4 juries vote for one, 4 for another, and 4 for another. It was choose your own adventure. That is not how legal systems run. And it just goes to show this was politics from the beginning. It was about getting Trump, showing the man, and I will show you the crime. It's just like the communist days all over again. Unfortunately, it's happening here in the United States.
Roger, Utah Senator Mitt Romney accused Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg of committing, quote, political malpractice by pursuing the Trump case. Seems like Republicans across the board are supporting Trump after these convictions. What say you on this?
Oh, yes. He just raked in $200 million in donations. That is extraordinary because the American people see right through this, right? This is a politically charged election interference. They're trying to take away the people's vote, the right to decide this at the ballot box instead of in the court of law. And this was a kangaroo court. And the American people were responding in droves. And you mentioned earlier the African-American vote. You would see an uptick there too. You know, there's a whole lot of concern over African-American exposure to the legal system. And now President Trump says, hey, look, I could relate. I was railroaded too. This happens. It could happen to the president. It could happen to you. It happens in the country. And we cannot have a weaponized justice system. Right. And that's one of the key campaign promises of President Trump, de-weaponize the justice system.
Okay, Roger, now listen to this. Former FBI Director James Comey, he says putting Trump in jail is doable. Roll tape.
Do you agree with that it would be difficult or nearly impossible for the law enforcement institutions to put him in actual...
I love James Comey. I think he's awesome because he's so amusing to listen to when it comes to his legal and political analysis. They asked him years back, would you testify against Andrew McCabe? He goes, potentially. Potentially. And he uses the words potentially all the time. It's amusing, very amusing. Then he's matter of fact. He can go to the yard. What is he? I forgot what he says. Listen to this.
Jail?
No, they would just put him in a double wide somewhere out near the fence, out in the grass.
Yeah, put Trump in the double wide. What's the problem?
And he would eat there, he'd shower there, he'd exercise there, he'd be away, as Danya Perry said, from general population, but it's obviously doable.
Roger, what do you think?
You put Trump in the double wide. What's the problem? He showers, he eats, he's a happy person. What? Nobody's above the law except Madam Secretary, who illegally transferred top secret intelligence onto servers, which is not even possible from a cybersecurity perspective. It's not even legally possible. I mean, it's not even possible from just the technological perspective. How do you email classified data from the government to someone's private server. It's not even possible. But then the Honorable James Comey says, no reasonable prosecutor would indict. Nah, unreasonable. Potentially. And double wide. What's the problem?
I think the chances are that Donald Trump will actually wind up in a jail cell.
I hope it's low, but the radical left shows there's no bottom to how craven they could be. The fact that it is a possibility is shocking. And look what's happened. It is as if the dog finally caught up to the bumper and caught it, and the left doesn't know what to do. They wanted to convict President Trump, 34 felonies. Most people get jail time for felonies. Maybe they'll put him in house arrest. Maybe they'll put an ankle bracelet on.
They're going to sentence him, and this man is brilliant. This is a brilliant, brilliant man, knows a lot more. Heritage Foundation VP, Roger Severino, absolutely brilliant. He knows a lot more about the law than I do, but I'll just say this. 100% they're going to give him a jail or prison sentence. 70% they're going to actually want to send him to jail. In the double wide that James Comey was talking about. Double wide, what's the problem? There's no problem. And so, could you imagine if an official in Trump's administration said, no problem. Put Hillary in the double wide. Put Biden in the double wide. No problem. What's the problem? They can shower and eat, have a good time. It's a good thing. Everything's fine. What's the problem? Oh my God, they would call Trump an authoritarian, a totalitarian, a despot. But with Trump, it's about the rule of law. Anyway, 100% they're going to give him a jail or prison sentence. And then the Supreme Court has to get involved. Has to. 100%. The Supreme Court, when they get it, I don't know when they'll get it, but when they get it, overturns the conviction. And you're going to see a meltdown of biblical proportions from the Democrats.
On him, who knows what they're going to do. They had their show trial, and now they're afraid of the consequences because they realize they made a tragic mistake here. The American people are rallying to President Trump. The radical left got what they wish for, but now they're realizing that maybe they should have been more careful what they wish for.
Trump says he's okay with house arrest or even jail. What do you make of that? Perhaps he wants it.
Well, yeah, there was a member of Congress was talking about introducing a bill to take away Secret Service protection of former presidents, to try to increase the odds if he goes to jail time that something bad happens to him. That is just extreme, right? The Secret Service is there to protect the president no matter the circumstances. And again, the fact that we're even discussing this shows that this is politics pure and simple. They distracted him from the campaign trail. He was sitting for weeks in a trial. He couldn't go out. He had a gag order. And this is the weaponization of the justice system. We are better than this as a country, but unfortunately, we're now joining the ranks of other countries that are called banana republics. This is a shameful day in our history.
Roger Severino is 100% correct. And like I told you, look. We have victory after victory on the horizon, ladies and gentlemen. The country, will prosper, will move on from this very nightmarish situation. They used to call it the age of Trump. Well, the age of Trump, because Democrats and media are so, they hyperventilate whenever things don't go their way. And they make everything so dramatic. The age of Trump, we saw record low poverty, record highs in household median income, very low interest rates, very low inflation. Now we have interest rates through the roof, record highs in credit card debt, inflation through the roof. You say through the roof, it's only 3.5%. No, food inflation is 30%. And we're on the brink of a terrible, terrible stock market collapse, a catastrophe in terms of crypto and the stock market. That's because you look at corporate profits are not going to justify the current stock market levels. Once traders or the market or hedge funds or mutual funds realize, oh my God, the current market valuation is not going to be justified by future earnings. Then everything collapses in terms of the market. That's because of Democrats and bureaucrats who shall remain nameless, who potentially committed, like the Honorable James Comey, potentially committed perjury. Certain government officials who shall remain nameless, who committed perjury, who said we should shut it down, shut it down. And then people wonder, well, gee, why is there so much debt? It's like, well, entire media, I cannot stand when people say, Trump, he spent so much his last year in office. It's like, that wasn't his doing. What was he supposed to do? Everyone blamed, like the Democrats and media blamed him for every life lost was his fault. And so you had Democrats and even Republicans saying, oh, yeah, shut everything down. So then people needed to, Democrats prevented people from paying their rent by working, so then they gave checks. There was nothing that Trump could have done. Trump should never have put bureaucrats who sound like this on television every day. That was something. Look, I love President Trump, but he's human. And he made certain mistakes. He made certain mistakes that a person in his position, breaking the barriers of status quo, should never have made. The biggest one, abandoning his national security advisor early on. But anyway, let's continue. And then he pardoned him. Okay.
Rightly, they did take that issue up. How do you see the arguments falling in that case?
Well, as you know, I predicted the outcome of this case exactly, how the court would decide 9-0 using the fifth section of the 14th Amendment. On the issue of immunity, I'm going to make a prediction here, too. I think both sides argue too broadly. I think Trump was wrong to have his lawyers say that if a president orders the SEALs to kill his opponent, he can be immunized unless he gets impeached first. That went too far. The answer should have been, of course not. Now let me explain. But I also think the lower court went way too far by having no immunity whatsoever and saying that whatever a president may have had immunity while in office, he loses that once he leaves office. I hope and I suspect that the court granted cert in this case in order to come out with a nuanced decision that focuses on precisely what are presidential acts. And if they're within the scope of presidential acts, then they have to go beyond the presidency itself. Let me give you an example. President Eisenhower in 1954 sends troops down to implement Brown versus Board of Education. One of the children or one of the police officers is killed. And the new president coming in, a Democrat, years later, wants to indict Eisenhower for having done that, even though it was in his presidential authority. I think we would all agree that there has to be some immunity, and we would all agree that he can't have total immunity for everything he did as a politician or as an individual. So I think the Supreme Court, hopefully, will come out with a nuanced decision that will give guidance to the lower courts as to when immunity is applicable, when it's not applicable. We can bring the country together on this issue as well, instead of simply having.
I love Professor Dershowitz. I think he's brilliant. I love, all his takes, and he knows infinitely more of the law than I do, but he's 100% right, and they will give him presidential immunity, which is what I've been saying, which is why the channel has been growing, and hit subscribe if you're new. But any nuanced decision will completely eviscerate or demolish the special counsel, eviscerate the indictment. They'll have to rewrite the indictment, and the trial will never take place. He'll win in a landslide November 5th, I think landslide. And then he'll dissolve the special counsel immediately. It'll be one of the most beautiful days in U.S. history. I shouldn't say that, but it'll be a great day. And the Democrats will be livid. They will be indignant. Oh, my God, The View, Jimmy Kimmel, Still Colbert, oh my God, they'll try to do away with the Supreme Court. There's no boundary. See, we've crossed the Rubicon. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, into Rome, we've crossed the Rubicon into an era of U.S. politics where Democrats will never concede they're wrong. Ever. Ever. Republicans will, but Democrats will never concede they're wrong.
Extreme views on both sides.
You know, I actually concur with what you just said. And I think, Greg, what Professor Dershowitz is saying is that the argument of absolute immunity probably is too broad, and a more nuanced judgment of the court, I think, would probably be more appropriate in this case, and maybe even the better argument for the court. Your take?
Well, I think the Supreme Court looked at the circuit court decision and said, hey, you went way too far. You're dismissing any notion of immunity, even if a president acts consistent with his duties. That is absurd logically. And it's inconsistent, by the way, and this is the important part, with the Supreme Court precedent 4 decades ago that a president does have absolute immunity from civil lawsuits as long as his actions fall within the outer perimeter of his official acts. Well, you know, Sean, the exact same reasoning applies to criminal prosecutions. If it's otherwise, my goodness, the chilling effect on presidential decision-making would trigger paralysis. Instead of a chief executive, so America Greg, would be ruled by a committee of lawyers. They'd be afraid to do anything out of fear of future prosecution.
Greg, let me ask you this. Would a more nuanced version versus the argument of absolute immunity maybe be, of course, you have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded building? Would that be?
Democrats don't like nuance. Do you understand? If it's, look, any judge that doesn't go their way, they say, oh my God, compromise, a Trump lackey. And then when Trump doesn't like a judge, oh my God, he's a despot. Ah! And it's like everything they claim to stand for, everything they don't like about Trump, actually they embody. So Trump doesn't do anything different from what Democrats do. Democrats do it, though, in their own morally superior, beautiful, wonderful, highly educated, liberal sensibilities. They do the same exact things as Trump, but when Trump does it, he's a despot, he's a tyrant, he's a totalitarian, he's mean, he's rude, he's boorish. But then when Democrats do it, well, of course, look, the judge is compromised. Do away with the Supreme Court. Add 50,000 more judges. And when he gets the immunity, which he will, it's so easy to understand. You'd have to be a complete imbecile not to believe or not to understand. You don't have to believe anything. You have to just have basic cursory knowledge of civics. A president, especially with Nixon v. Fitzgerald, is protected by the Constitution. He has presidential immunity. That's why, he could, get George W. Bush got us into never-ending military conflict, counterinsurgency conflicts. Okay, terrible decision making. He's not being indicted anywhere ever. He will never be indicted ever. But Trump, because he paid Stormy, was convicted. So George W. Bush, endless wars, and Trump, Stormy, convicted. Prison. Trump, prison. Bush, good. This is the Democratic Party mentality.
Would there be an analogy there?
Yes.
And you would expect the court to do that.
And Jordan said this as well. I suspect the current justices will extend the existing immunity standard in civil actions to criminal cases and then remand the Trump case back to the trial court to decide whether Trump's acts are covered as official acts.
When they remand to the trial court and they ask lower courts to decide what is official and unofficial, the Democrats will go beyond angry, livid, furious. If they don't get exactly what they want, they will disown friends and family. They will yell, scream, call Trump a tyrant. They'll want to dissolve the Supreme Court. You know what they would, if you told Democrats tomorrow they could dissolve the Supreme Court, maybe 10% of them would actually vote for the bill. Maybe literally 5 to 10% would vote And maybe I'm being generous. Maybe I'm being gracious. Maybe it's more than 10%. 10% of the Democrats today would vote to dissolve the Supreme Court. Okay? Wait, it would be impossible to do so. It's the court. It's a core tenet, a pillar of our republic and democracy and the Constitution. A separation of powers, the judicial branch. But again, it's like if they don't get what they want, it's the end of the world. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the... This should show you exactly also, going back to the guilty verdict, there was no crime.
All right, so Trump's indictment looks like a perversion of campaign finance laws. There are no crimes committed, or at least that's what Bradley Smith, Capital University law professor, chairman, and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. Mr. Smith is a former FEC commissioner, and he's the co-author of Voting Rights and Election Law. Brad, you're writing in the Wall Street Journal. We've been trying to get our paws on you for the show. Thank you for coming on. You're saying there was no crime.
My pleasure.
There was no crime to start with. Even if there were some issues on the so-called filing of business papers, there was still no crime.
Right. I've had a bit more time. I had the commercial break to look at the indictment a bit more, and it looks like the last couple pages of the indictment do intend to say that the crime was not disclosing campaign contributions, although they never cite a specific government statute. But here's the problem here. The prosecutor's theory goes like this. Federal law says it's a campaign contribution to make an expenditure for the purpose of influencing a federal election. Those are the key words, for the purpose of influencing. And he says, well, these payments were intended to keep her quiet, which would help the campaign, so they were for the purpose of influencing the campaign. Now, first, these payments could have been made for other reasons, right? To prevent embarrassment to his family, to preserve marital harmony, all kinds of things. But none of that really matters, because the standard here for the purpose of influencing is not a subjective standard, it's an objective one. So if I go out and I want to pay for TV ads that say, Donald Trump is a ding-dong daddy from Dumas Bay, because I think that's really going to help him win re-election, it doesn't matter. Legally, that will not be for the purpose of influencing an election, no matter what my own subjective purpose was, right? It's subjective. So what counts as campaign expenditures? Things like, you don't hire a campaign manager unless you're running for office. Right. You don't take out ads saying vote for me unless you're running for office. You don't hire or establish field offices unless you're running for office. But other things you do. For example, you buy clothes whether you're running for office or not. So the fact that I'm running for office and I say, I've got to look good, and I go out and I buy a $6,000 suit that I would never otherwise buy, doesn't make it a campaign expenditure. It doesn't count. Same if I say I need a $600 haircut. Or to take a more perhaps relevant example, suppose I'm a business owner and I say I'm going to run for office, and I go to my corporate lawyer and I say, there's some lawsuits against our corporation. I think they're bogus, but let's get rid of them so they don't interfere with my run. Just settle those lawsuits. You can't settle those with campaign funds. It's not a campaign expense, even though that person's subjective purpose was to influence the campaign.
By the way,
so that's a very important part of the law.
I know. I was very impressed with the $6,000 suit. That must have been a custom bespoke suit. In your op-ed piece, it was $4,000, but I know we've had an inflation problem in the last couple of weeks. But your point here, I'm just having some fun, but your point here, Brad, if I understand it, is that you buy a suit, you get a nice haircut, whatever, you're doing it directly for the campaign. Is that correct? That's the point you're making. But if you want to
the point is, yeah.
If you want to defend yourself, your honor, keep it away from your wife, that kind of thing, which, by the way, is unproven. I mean, Stormy Daniels keeps telling people she didn't have an affair. Nobody wants to listen to her, but that's perhaps grist for another segment. But if that does not qualify because it's not directly for the campaign. Is that right? Is that my correct interpretation?
It actually goes further than that. Even though you bought that suit because you were running for office and want it to look good, it's still not a campaign expenditure.
Oh.
Why? Because you buy clothes. You buy clothes whether you're running for office or not, right? And so anything that people might do, even if they're not running for office, doesn't count. So people pay money. For example, they pay divorce attorneys to try to seal up their divorce records so that those don't become an embarrassment.
Are you listening to this morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrats? There was no crime. We always knew this.
of the campaign.
Right.
Their purpose may be to influence the campaign, but it's an expenditure that somebody who wasn't running for office might also make. The only things that count are things that come directly out of the fact that you're campaigning. And the flip side of this is that it's actually illegal to convert your campaign funds then to personal use. So it's actually illegal to use your campaign funds to buy that suit. It's illegal to use your campaign funds to pay a lawyer to seal your divorce records because you think that will help your campaign. And this is the real problem you have here. Not only is there, I think, not a campaign finance violation, this underlying alleged violation, but it's a situation where they're going to get Trump coming or going, because I think, knowing Bragg, and you've set the political stage very well, had Trump paid for this with campaign funds, I think we can feel pretty certain that he would be being charged today with having illegally converted his campaign funds to personal use. In other words, they were going to get him coming or going. If he pays for it with campaign funds, they were going to say it was illegal personal use. If he doesn't pay this money with campaign funds, which was the reality, now they say, oh, well, he should have used campaign funds. And that's, the antithesis of the rule of law, where you set up a system where no matter what course of action a person takes, they're going to be held in violation of the law.
Well, I mean, but how does that get up to the Federal Election Commission, which is
wonderful, highly educated liberal Democrats? Please listen.
Has already turned this case down once.
Right. Well, this raises yet another question, is can, of course, a state prosecutor prosecute an alleged, quote, federal crime that the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice have already decided not to prosecute? We might think about it this way. Imagine if New York just passed a law saying it is a violation of the New York Penal Code to violate any federal law. And then we'll decide what federal law is violated, right? That would subvert the entire federal state structure of law. I mean, that would allow state DAs to start prosecuting anything they think is a violation of federal law, even though the federal courts or federal administrative agencies or the Department of Justice had thought it was not a violation of federal law. So it's really getting into sort of wacky legal theories, but also I think very dangerous theories. Again, if we think about the rule of law, I don't think this can be emphasized enough that if Trump had paid for these with campaign funds, which the DA says he had to have done, I think they'd probably be chasing him today for illegal conversion of campaign funds to pay this personal expense.
We don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, this week you're going to get the immunity decision. You're also going to get a pretty hilarious debate where Trump is going to dominate. And as long as mashed potato brains, exists, then I guess the Democrats will be, the media, Biden really won, Trump lost. No matter what happens, I learned this a long time ago when I was the biggest Bernie Sanders booster on the internet, according to the Huffington Post. And the unofficial scribe, Sanders' most hardcore voters, according to the Washington Post. And I love Trump now and for the past, 6 years or so, 7 years. But I wish I would have written all about how great Trump would be, and he was an amazing president. I mean, you'd have to be foolish and know nothing about politics to say that his presidency wasn't a success by traditional standards. It was a success if you measure a presidency by the economy and foreign policy. And by the way, the apoplectic reaction of Democrats on social media, newspapers, media, it's like, that doesn't mean that Trump wasn't a good president. He was. They just made absurd leaps of logic. Very fine people. Oh, that was a hoax. Kremlin operative, that was a hoax. All they do is lie about Trump. Then they hyperventilate about lying. Anyway, 2 major Supreme Court decisions. Hit subscribe to the channel. Be here tomorrow and throughout the week. I should be doing a live stream at about 3 p.m., 4 p.m. tomorrow, and then a second one in the evening as well. I'll step it up the next couple of days because we're going to have huge victories, people. November 5th, the channel's growing because we're just winning. All Trump does is win, win, win. No matter what, he's just going to win. That's all he's going to do. Hit subscribe, people.